Hi guys, thank you for coming out to McNally Jackson Books tonight. I hope you guys will join me in welcoming Kenneth Davis.
Good evening and welcome to all of my good friends. One of the things I always like to do when I speak about my books is tell people how I got here in the first place, specifically here to the McNally Jackson bookstore, because I started out a long time ago not writing books but selling them. 34 years ago, in fact, I walked into a bookstore in Manhattan, a small bookstore that no longer exists, and I was getting interviewed for a job, and the interview for the job kind of went along the lines of, well, where would you put a book by William Shakespeare? Where would you put a book by Dostoevsky? Where would you find games people play? And I had to sort of answer these like 20 question style in the middle of a busy lunch hour in a Manhattan bookstore in the midst of Grand Central Station. So it was a little odd job interview. And finally, a young woman who's at the bookstore cash register said, "Oh, hire the kid." And the owner of the store took her advice. A few months later, that same woman read some of the work I was doing in college, doing some writing, and she said, "You're really wasting your time. You should be writing books, not selling them." And she was so smart, I married her, and that's my wife, Joanne. And here we are, 30 years later. I am writing the books and trying to sell them too in a sort of different way. But independent bookstores have been part of my life for a very long time. I went from actually selling those books in the bookstore to writing about books. My first job as a writer was working for Publishers Weekly, where I made the princely sum of reviewing books for about $10 a pop. And it was a great education, actually, because you had to read great writing, sometimes not so great writing, and condense it down into 7 quick sentences for Publishers Weekly, which is a review medium that goes to the book trade. So it was an interesting way to crystallize how to reduce information into a few short sentences and find a meaningful way to talk about books that were either really bad or sometimes incredibly good. And it was a wonderful learning experience. I have to just comment here while I'm talking about great bookstores and books. I come to McNally Jackson and I look at these books suspended from the ceiling, and I always have to wonder if they're the books that they like or the books that they don't like, that they're impaled up there. I don't know, like Moby Dick's, I can understand impaling Moby Dick, kind of harpooned to the ceiling there, but it's a reminder that we are indeed being rained upon by books, literally. So my career began at $10 a pop, like I said, and it's a long way to make a living at $10 a pop. So I moved on to writing longer pieces. One of the great things being a book reviewer for Publishers Weekly I got to do was interview writers. If I really loved a book, sometimes I would get to interview the author. And one of the thrills of my life as a very young writer was reading a book called The Executioner's Song by Norman Mailer. And there I was in my 20s with the assignment to go over to Brooklyn and interview Norman Mailer and get paid for it. I think I got about $100 for that one. So I was really making my way up in the world. But as time went by, I realized that you're not going to just make a living at $10 a pop or even $100 a pop. You have to write a book. So I actually wrote a book about the publishing industry, and for which I was paid $10,000, and it took 3 years to write. So you figure it out. And there was also the agent's commission in there. So I was quickly learning that there are faster ways to make a buck than writing. Continuing with my book-selling career at the same time I was trying to write, I was very fortunate once again that my very smart wife said to me, "You love American history. Why don't you write about it? And that was really the beginning of deciding to write a book called Don't Know Much About History, although it wasn't called Don't Know Much About History when I started. I think the original title was something like Everything You Forgot About History But Your Kids Are Asking You Now. And we said, gee, that title doesn't work. And I was just sitting around one day and it popped into my head, Sam Cooke, Don't Know Much About History, and that was all we needed. That book went on to, by the way, it's 20 years old, which is an astonishing idea to me. Don't Know Much About History was published in 1990, and that is 20 years ago. It was just about this time, 20 years ago. In its paperback edition, it then went on to the New York Times bestseller list for 35 consecutive weeks, sold 1.5 million copies over time, astonishing everybody, especially me, because I was not a person with academic credentials. The dirty little secret is I had never finished college, and nobody knew who I was. But this book came out and really caught everyone by surprise. It came out at a time when people were saying, we are really dumb when it comes to history. It was around this time that the first surveys and studies were coming out that said American students couldn't answer the most basic questions about history. Who wrote the Declaration of Independence? When did the Civil War happen? And as I talked to people around the country, and as I looked at the books that were on the bookshelves, it became readily apparent to me why we don't know much about history. Most people think it's boring, and that's the word I heard time and time again. And that's surprising to me because history to me is anything but boring. History is about real people doing extraordinary things. And if we tell stories about real people doing extraordinary things, it can never be boring. So I wanted to approach history the way I always loved it, as real stories of real people, and talking to people in a language they understand, and asking questions. And that's the essence of the Don't Know Much About series, asking questions and answering them in a few short questions, in a few short pages or paragraphs. Sometimes the questions are fairly straightforward. What is the Mayflower Compact? What is manifest destiny? Sometimes the questions were a little bit more offbeat and quirky. Why is there a statue of Benedict Arnold's boot? And did Columbus's men really bring syphilis back to Europe? And I thought that asking and answering questions like that would get people a little bit more interested in what I was interested in, the real people that are at the heart of history. The way I fell in love with history was really as a small child. I was very, very lucky that my parents thought our idea of summer vacation was to throw a tent, an Army surplus tent, in the back of a car and go off to a place like Fort Ticonderoga or Gettysburg or Valley Forge. So even from a very young age, when I was a kid, no more than 5 or 6, I always had this sense that history didn't happen in books, but it happened in real places to real people. And that's essentially what I've tried to do in my books, starting with Don't Know Much About History. Great history is really about great storytelling. And great storytelling is always about finding the extraordinary moments that change people, change history, change us. And that's what I've tried to do in my books, and do it in a way that speaks to people in a language they understand. One of the great problems, it seems to me, about history and hearing from people about history is that the academics and the professors really like to talk to each other, and they left us out of the conversation. And I just wanted to write in a style that brought everybody into the conversation, so that's what a Don't Know Much About book was always about. The other thing I've heard over the years, many, many times, and I hope I'm not casting any aspersions on football coaches here, but many, many people have told me over the years that the problem with history was that they learned from the football coach. I don't know why this is that football coaches get assigned to teach history, but it seems to be the case almost everywhere, maybe outside of New York. Maybe they just need something else for the coach to do for the rest of the day, and they think football's kind of like war and history's about war, so let the football coach teach history. Now, I'm sure there are many, many great football coaches who are also great history teachers. I haven't heard about too many of them. I can only report I've heard about the football coaches who are lousy history teachers. So that's one of my theories of why we are so bad at history. The other reason is back in the news, textbooks. I'm sure you have all heard about what's going on in Texas, where they are rewriting the history textbook standards. And the hair on the back of my neck rises very harshly when I hear the things that are going on in Texas, where they want to replace Thomas Jefferson, who gets way too much attention, with Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy. That makes me tremble a little bit. I think we have to rethink that one a little bit. They certainly want to spend more time talking about the great conservative movement of the last 20 years. And I think that's a perfectly fine idea as long as it's treated accurately and with some respect for the truth, because the truth is always what matters as far as I'm concerned with history. I've never written history, I don't think, with a particular political mindset, although I'm always surprised to see some of the reviews is not a fair word. Comments, I suppose, that one sees online about how liberal I am, or how I'm a leftist, or how I'm practically a communist. I think I'm pretty much middle of the road, and again, my interest has always been much more about accuracy than any kind of political point of view. But it's always been, as I said, really about the stories. And that's where I come to this new book, A Nation Rising. When I wrote Don't Know Much About History, and later the other Don't Know Much About books, they were written, as I said, question and answer style, written to ask and answer some easy questions, or sometimes some tough questions with some easy answers. But I always found stories that I thought needed a little bit more space, a little bit more telling. And with my previous book, America's Hidden History, I wanted to open up on some of those stories that I had come across and felt really needed to be told in greater depth and with a little bit more dramatic intensity. America's Hidden History was published 2 years ago and did that. 6 stories that went from the founding, the European arrival in America, the first encounter of Europeans in America, the arrival of the first pilgrims in America, who were not Englishmen in Massachusetts, but Frenchmen in Florida. That story got left out of my textbook. I don't know if it was in yours, but there were French Huguenots who landed in Florida in June of 1565. In other words, 50 years before the Mayflower sailed. They were wiped out, and they were wiped out by the Spanish. And the Spanish did this to the Frenchmen, not because they were French, but because they were Protestant. In other words, the first encounter of Europeans in what would become America was a religious bloodbath, and we've been fighting about religion ever since. That is a theme that I return to in in A Nation Rising. America's Hidden History went up to around the time of George Washington's inauguration. This new book picks up in 1800 and covers the next 50 years of American history. In other words, from about 1800 to 1850, the time when we went from 13 struggling states strung out along the eastern seaboard to a near empire that went from sea to shining sea, with the admission of California into the Union in 1850. And I've told the story of these extraordinary 50 years that have really been overlooked by school books, by textbooks. They've fallen into that black hole that we call American history, but they are 50 of the most extraordinary years in our history, and 50 years that are filled with extraordinary people. And I've tried to focus on some of those people, especially people who get left out of the textbooks. These are what I call untold tales. They are people that you may have heard of, but only in passing, starting with, for instance, Aaron Burr. Most people hear that name, they think of one thing, a duel with Alexander Hamilton. They're not quite sure why there was a duel, but it turns out that Aaron Burr is one of the most fascinating characters in American history, and he was reduced to a single line in the textbooks, or a villain. And he was reduced to a villain for the main reason that for a long time, the history books were written by Thomas Jefferson's friends. And Thomas Jefferson had no love for Aaron Burr. And that was reflected in the way that Aaron Burr was written about in our history books. Aaron Burr was one of the most extraordinary men in American history. And I discovered him when I was doing the research actually for America's Hidden History, because as a 19-year-old kid, Aaron Burr went off into the Maine woods with the other great villain of American history, Benedict Arnold. And this was during the American Revolution in 1775. They marched through the Maine woods, about 1,000 men, and about 300 of them either died or deserted along the way. It was one of the great military disasters of the Revolution. But I thought, wow, to be on this trip, to be a fly on the wall with Aaron Burr and Benedict Arnold tramping through the Maine woods together must have been an extraordinary moment. The expedition, which was an attack on Quebec, ended up in disaster, but Burr became a hero in the course of that. In fact, there was a painting that every school child in America saw of Aaron Burr in front of the gates of Quebec with the dying general in his arms. And it was one of the reasons that Aaron Burr was a hero of the American Revolution. Then he went on, of course, to become Thomas Jefferson's vice president through a curious chain of events. They ran together, but in those days, the election worked that the first place finisher was president, and the second place finisher was vice president. In this case, however, Jefferson and Burr finished in a tie, and the vote went to the House of Representatives. From the very minute that happened, Thomas Jefferson was convinced that Aaron Burr was trying to steal the presidency from him. It began a vicious political vendetta that lasted for years. And after Aaron Burr was left the vice presidency and had already killed Alexander Hamilton, he went off to start a sort of adventure, which wasn't even illegal in those days. He was going to perhaps take Florida away from the Spanish, or take Mexico away from the Spanish, or maybe peel off a piece of the Louisiana Purchase for himself and set himself up as emperor. Well, that's what the newspapers said, at least. Thomas Jefferson one day announced that Aaron Burr was doing this and said, he's committed treason. Acting as judge, jury, and reporter, Thomas Jefferson was out to destroy Aaron Burr. And I tell the story of Aaron Burr's trial, not for the murder of Alexander Hamilton, but for treason in the first chapter of A Nation Rising. And it opens up the whole period, a period of expansion, a period of moving into territory that was either owned by the Spanish or by Indians or by somebody else. It was presented to us as this neat thing called Manifest Destiny, but it was the beginning of 50 years of conquest, conspiracy, and corruption. And these are the stories I've tried to tell in A Nation Rising. Part of that conquest is the relationship between the American government and Native American nations, like the Creeks. And I discuss this in the second chapter of the book, which is called Weatherford's War. And in this chapter, I focus on a man named William Weatherford, again, a man who completely left out of my textbooks, my school books, but he was as compelling a character as Mel Gibson's Braveheart, and you could certainly say he'd make a great movie. He was, in fact, half Scottish, just like Braveheart. The other half was Creek Indian. William Weatherford led the Creek Indians, who were one of the civilized tribes of the Southeast, in a war against the American government. The troops of the American government at that time were led by a fellow named Andrew Jackson. the Indians came to know Andrew Jackson by a different name, Sharp Knife. In one of the vicious battles of this Creek War that Andrew Jackson led against William Weatherford, Andrew Jackson had his men cut off the noses of the fallen Indians to count the casualties. They left that one out of my school books. And that, by the way, is one of the reasons that a great many descendants of Native Americans and others think that Andrew Jackson's picture shouldn't be on the $20 bill, and they won't use a $20 bill because a Indian slaughtering, slave-holding, killing machine, as he has been described, should hardly be on our currency. I moved to another aspect of this period in our history, which is also very much in the news, in another chapter of the book called Morses Code. And it's a chapter that talks about religion, going back to the notion of Spanish Catholics killing French Protestants. It's about religion and immigration, two subjects that are certainly very much in the news today. And it's also another chapter in our history that was left out of my school books, the Bible riots in Philadelphia. In 1844, Philadelphia was torn in two by a series of violent riots, all fought over two simple things, immigration and religion, and they were very closely related in those days. In those days, the immigrants that people hated were Catholics, and Irish Catholics specifically. In fact, in Philadelphia, the Irish were said to be scum unloaded on the wharves. Right in the middle of the first great American Depression, the Irish were taking jobs and running down wages. They were introducing diseases like typhus and cholera. All sounds very familiar, doesn't it? Diseases, running down wages, scum unloaded to take jobs away, not speaking English, speaking as sort of this Irish language that was foreign to Americans. But worse than that, these Irish Catholics were part of a conspiracy. Yes, they were going to take over the nation and turn America over to the Pope and build a new Vatican in Cincinnati. This was not a lunatic fringe idea. This was an idea that was preached in some of the most prominent pulpits in America by some of the most prominent Protestant ministers in America. And it speaks to this very, very deep hatred between Protestant and Catholic that was part of America from the very arrival of the Pilgrims and the Puritans. Again, it's a story completely left out of our school books. It's a story that flies completely in the face of this notion that we are a Christian nation. And it's a story I think that's so important to tell to show how we have been dealing with this immigration question and this religion question in this country for more than 200 years. And it still affects our policies, our politics, and the way we deal with each other every day, which is the real point in studying history, in learning history, in talking about history in the first place. So I've written stories from the distant American past that seem awfully fresh. Stories about religion and immigration. Stories about, I left one out, there's an interesting one here. One of the most interesting characters of the 19th century, of this period that I'm talking about, was a fellow named John Charles Fremont. By far the most famous man in America in his day, and his beautiful young wife, Jessie Benton Fremont. If People magazine had been around in those days, they would have been the cover story as the power couple. But Fremont and his wife, Jessie, had eloped when she was only 17, and the only priest that they could get to marry them was a Catholic priest. Now, in 1856, when John Charles Fremont, who had actually opened up California to all the settlers, was running for president as the first Republican candidate, the fact that he had been married by a Catholic priest meant he was a Catholic. The fact that his father was from Canada meant he was French Canadian. And so there was a 19th century birther movement, because John Charles Fremont was said to be a French Canadian and a Catholic. And these were two really big strikes against him. And it was actually absolutely an issue in the 1856 election. He probably would have lost anyway because he was also an abolitionist. But it just speaks, again, to this idea that we keep going over and over the same themes, the same trends in our history, and we can look back and see these people, these extraordinary people, and learn from it and see what is happening in America today and try and get some insight and try and figure out what it is that we're trying to do. So that, to me, is the purpose of writing history. That, to me, is the purpose of studying history, bringing the past to an understanding of the present. And I've always done it by asking questions, and I hope that you might have some questions for me as well. So anybody would like to ask a question, I'd welcome your input. Okay.
Can I ask, you mentioned some of these characters as being sort of the most famous people in the nation during your day. How does that make research very easy? Do you just go into a library in a certain year and they're splashed across the headlines, or do you have to go a little more?
It's really fascinating to go back and look at the 19th century. First of all, it was an era of the newspapers. There were many, many newspapers. And by the way, the newspapers of the 19th century were far, far more partisan than our newspapers today. We think about, fair and balanced or a liberal media or something like that. But in those days, the newspapers were almost always aligned with a particular party and very often with a personality. Thomas Jefferson had newspapers that were specifically working in his favor. Aaron Burr owned a newspaper in New York. In fact, while he was on trial, the newspaper came down to cover his trial. It was a media sensation. It was the trial of the century without any question. It was held in Richmond, Virginia, which was a town of about 5,000 at the time. And the population literally doubled overnight because of all the people who came to cover this trial. Because Aaron Burr was without question one of the most famous men in America at the time. One of the correspondents for his newspaper was a young New York attorney who was turning writer, and his name was Washington Irving. Washington Irving's first writing work was as a reporter for Aaron Burr's newspaper. He then went on to much greater fame and writing about Gotham and the Knickerbockers and the Legend of Sleepy Hollow. But that was the beginning of Washington Irving's career. So the newspapers of that time were filled often with very vitriolic political stuff. But yeah, these were people who were on the front pages every day. The beauty of, obviously, the internet is that much more of that is accessible. The sad part for me as a historian is that these stories are kind of buried. Yes, academics know them, people with a specialty know them, but most of us never hear them, and that's too bad because they are fascinating stories about real people, and nobody can hear these stories and claim to be bored by history. That to me is the sad downside of how badly we teach and study history in America.
Can I ask again?
You can ask as many questions.
I have so many. I'm going to keep them coming. So obviously, a lot of the history in the book is bitter and bloody, but also feels very collegial in a certain sense. All these people seem to have known each other and intermingled in ways that we find kind of unimaginable. Does it make you a little bit nostalgic for a time when vice presidents could then become emperors, could then become hated?
That's interesting. Well, first of all, it was a lot smaller country then, so and people in power really did know each other. You have to remember, of course, when we're talking about the revolutionary generation, for instance. Aaron Burr was part of the revolutionary generation. Just a few more pieces about him. His grandfather was Jonathan Edwards. Jonathan Edwards was the most prominent minister in America. It's funny because Aaron Burr has this kind of womanizing, licentious character. He actually started out studying for the ministry. His grandfather, as I said, was the most famous minister in America. Jonathan Edwards gave sermons that, if you go and read the most important sermons in America, you'll start out reading Jonathan Edwards' sermons. His father, Aaron Burr Sr., was also a minister, and during a split in the Protestant church at that time, and there were many fractures along denominational lines, he started a small college in New Jersey called the College of New Jersey, which later moved to a little town called Princeton. And so Aaron Burr's father really founded Princeton. Aaron Burr is in fact buried at Princeton, where his father is buried as well. So these are the fascinating little aspects of these characters that you explore. And yes, they all did know each other because many of them served together in the Revolution. As I said, Aaron Burr and Benedict Arnold going off together during the war. Aaron Burr being promoted then and becoming an aide to General Washington. By the way, General Washington's headquarters were on Charlton and Varick. There's a small plaque there. That home, the home doesn't stand any longer. It was called Richmond Hill. That estate later became John Adams's home when he was vice president during the first administration when the Capitol was in New York. And then Aaron Burr later bought that property, and it was his own estate when he was a rather young but very successful attorney in New York. And Greenwich Village, which it was very different from New York, which was mostly just sequestered down around what is the financial district right now. So it's also a wonderful period in New York history. You have all these characters running around. But yeah, Aaron Burr and Hamilton were in the midst of and the thick of New York politics together. Then they go off to Congress together. Then they serve together. Burr, as I mentioned, becomes Jefferson's vice president in an ugly, ugly scene. He decides after being vice president for the first time, and it's clear that Jefferson doesn't want him to run again, that he'll run for governor of New York. And when he comes back and runs for governor, Alexander Hamilton then begins the whispering campaign that he's this licentious, horrible person. And it's that whispering campaign that was fed into the newspapers that really is the cause for the duel, in which, of course, Aaron Burr shoots and kills Alexander Hamilton, and is never tried for that, by the way. It was not illegal to duel at that time in New Jersey. They actually went by rowboat from New York across to Weehawken, New Jersey, which is kind of where the Lincoln Tunnel comes out of on the New Jersey side. Little spot right above the Hudson River there is where Aaron Burr and Alexander Hamilton had their duel. There are some incredible other coincidences like that I talk about in this book. One of them, Aaron Burr, the next connection is one of the people he recruits to be in this conspiracy that was being floated around, which also was, no one thought it was illegal until Thomas Jefferson decided that he was going to use this to drive Burr into the ground. But Burr goes down to Nashville and recruits a young planter there to build some boats for him, and his name is Andrew Jackson. Andrew Jackson then went on to be, was not a witness at the trial of Burr, but went to Richmond and would stand outside every day and talk about how awful Thomas Jefferson was. So it's the connection from Burr to Jackson that gets spun out. Jackson is also quite a famous duelist. He had killed a man in a duel, and in the midst of another argument, had started a gun and knife fight. And in the hotel where the gun and knife fight, just outside the hotel, John Fremont is actually there as an infant. So there's this incredible, really, string of coincidental events that connects all these people that run throughout this book. And a part of it certainly is just it was a smaller country, and so people. But my favorite coincidence is the fact that I wrote about in America's Hidden History a wonderful character, one of what I call the forgotten founders, named Joseph Warren, who was a physician in Massachusetts and really one of the key people in fomenting the American Revolution, but kind of got forgotten. Joseph Warren was very close friends with Paul Revere, and it's Joseph Warren who actually gives Paul Revere his riding orders on that famous night. Then I discovered that Joseph Warren Revere, Paul Revere's grandson, was in California with Fremont, and he's the one who actually plants the flag. So it's this incredible connection of one generation coming down to the next, and those are the kind of little coincidences and connections and threads through history that I love to find, and those are the kind of things I try and put into the book. Somebody else?
Okay, just without being American, I dare the question. Was there any controversy about the immigrants from Europe who left Europe after the failed revolution of 1848? Or were they always just welcomed as freedom fighters? Or was there also possibly, because of various national backgrounds, not all of them were keen Protestants, or also did shady Catholics at that time? I know next to nothing about it, but not just from the European point of view, of course, I'm familiar with so many of them left.
Very interesting question. To recap briefly, what was the attitude towards many of the European immigrants, especially in the 1840s? One of the things I do detail in this book is not just the anti-Catholic sentiment that was in Philadelphia and the anti-Irish sentiment in Philadelphia in the 1840s, but a long string of anti-immigrant, anti-Catholic sentiment that's in America from the very beginning. Going back to the time of the Puritans. But in the 1750s, for instance, well before America was born, there were complaints in Pennsylvania about the immigrants then. The complaints were that these people were coming in and they didn't speak English, they weren't teaching their children to speak English, their signs were all in their own language, and the person who complained about this was Benjamin Franklin, and the people he was complaining about were Germans. So every generation, it seems, has had then it was the Spanish, then it was the French, then it was the Irish, and the Irish lasted a long time. Of course, it was until 1960, of course, that maybe a whole anti-Catholic mood was put to rest. But you have to remember in this country that even in the 1920s, for instance, we think about the Ku Klux Klan being opposed to blacks, but part of the Ku Klux Klan was just as vociferously opposed to foreigners, Catholics, and Jews as they were to blacks. So this was part of America's political DNA from the very beginning of the country. But absolutely every generation has looked at European immigrants in different ways, often as threats. And it was later the Bohemians, then the Poles, every generation that came over. Certainly in the 1920s, it was the fear of the socialists coming into the country. The first great fear of Bolshevism happens at that time. So I would say, yes, every generation throughout American history has really responded to foreigners. We don't like foreigners. We have this myth of the melting pot, but it is absolutely that, a myth. And that's why we have neighborhoods that are very sequestered, and we have ghettos, and we have Koreatown and Little Italy and Chinatown, because people have always come to America and we like the image of them sailing past the Statue of Liberty and, being welcomed, the huddle masses and all that. But they usually come and then we sequester them in ghettos and think up appropriately derisive nicknames for them. And that's been the history of immigration for most of our time. Somebody else?
Yes.
Was there a golden era of secularization coming from policymakers and the gentry overall, or is that time now? or is it better?
Golden age of secularization. I'm not sure.
Secularism.
You mean when we weren't crazy religious fanatics?
Yeah.
No, there's never been a period of that we weren't crazy religious fanatics.
I mean, just like at least kind of reduce as far as policies, or you could actually be a president, you could actually be high up in politics and say that, or never talk about religion, for example, which you can't do now.
No, I don't think that that's ever been true, and the fact that John Kennedy wasn't elected until 1960. That's our first Catholic president, obviously. If you go back a little bit earlier, Al Smith was the governor of New York. He was a Catholic, couldn't get elected in part because he was said to be, his campaign was about rum, Romanism, and ruin. The idea was still well into the 1920s that the Pope was going to be in charge. That was an ingrained ideal among mainstream Protestants in this country. I think if a golden age of secularism, I think that the evangelicals and the people in Texas who are trying to make this case for a Christian nation like to point back to the founding fathers and say that but I think that might have been perhaps as good a moment for secularism as any. They were all clearly Christians of various degrees of belief. I mean, Thomas Jefferson is obviously a long way from John Adams, who was quite a Puritan at heart. But they were people who also saw the danger. They had just fought a war in which the enemy, the head of the state of the enemy, was also the head of the church, the King of England. They knew and understood the danger of connecting church and state, and that's why so many of them were so vigorously opposed to it. But this notion that this was, some fundamental evangelical group of founders that founded the nation and wrote the Constitution based on the Ten Commandments is really nonsense. These guys were much more influenced by, for instance, the Roman Republic than they were by Moses and the tribes of Israel. But that is a fact that is not getting much attention these days, because we do have people who get on major television programs and say we're a Christian nation, and nobody refutes that. Yes, we've been predominantly Christian throughout our history, but there's a big difference between that and the founding principles of the founders and the framers of the Constitution, who believe that government exists to protect people's rights, not to save their souls. And but religion has always had an outsized influence on this country's politics, and was really the election of Kennedy. And by the way, he made a speech in 1960 during the campaign about his Catholicism and that he was a loyal American, which was a fabulous speech and probably went a long way to helping him get elected. But we still see there's still skepticism about somebody like Mitt Romney, who's a Mormon. There's tremendous suspicion in mainstream, especially evangelical Protestantism, about Mormonism. So I don't think we've seen the end of that. And forget, the idea of somebody Islamic these days. I mean, we're seeing that happen even as we talk about a president who is clearly a Christian, but is represented in a lot of the media as a Muslim. So, yeah.
So I have a question. I appreciate the idea that there's a hidden history, just the sort of fascinating figures that you've been talking about who need to be brought to public attention. But you also talk about the way in which most of them were quite famous in their own times. And I wonder about just the ordinary people. I mean, how important is it to find the stories of ordinary people who, I think about Marshall Berman's great story about coming into the city with his dad from the Bronx, and his dad would say, "Look at all these buildings, do you know who built all these buildings?" And he'd say, "No, Pop who?" And they would say, "Somebody who worked themselves to death that you never heard of." And that's kind of, I think, an important part of our history that's hidden. What about all the convict labor that put up the city of New York in the 1830s?
I think you're absolutely correct, and that's
is there a way to tell those stories?
Well, I think there is, and for instance, an example in this book, I talk about this whole period of the anti-Catholic mood in Philadelphia. One of the reasons that there were so many Irish Catholics in Philadelphia is that they were brought in to build a railroad and canal. And they were, of course, pushed into tenements or small areas. I write about somebody going out and trying to do a survey of the families, and they find that there were 50 families with one privy. This led to tremendous cholera and typhus epidemics, and in fact, it was just a few years ago that they found a mass grave of Irish railroad workers, presumed to be Irish railroad workers. So yes, that history is part of this history as well. I think, you know, that.
Are they consigned to anonymity in your story?
Well, they are anonymous in this
But
case.
is there a way to find someone who's represent? I think about some great social historians who are also good storytellers, like Timothy Guilfoyle or Laurel Ulrich, who they happen upon an ordinary person who then can become representative of those anonymous masses, and so we can use them and to tell the stories of those people.
Yeah, what you're talking about. Sure, I focus in this book on some people who were famous, but some who are not famous as well. And perhaps in my previous book, America's Hidden History, there's a better example of that in the story of a woman named Hannah Duston. I don't know if you've ever heard her name. She actually became famous in her time, but she was the most average woman you could imagine in 1695 New England. She was taken captive by Abenaki Indians, taken off to an island. In the middle of the night, she and two fellow captives got up and killed their captives, 10 of the 12 Indians. She left, then came back because she remembered that the colony of Massachusetts was then paying a ransom for the scalps of Indians. So she goes back and scalps the 10 Indians and goes back to Boston. She became the most famous woman in America in her day. There was actually the first statue to a woman in America was put up to Hannah Duston. She was a farmer's wife, an average person. She became famous. In fact, the statue showed her with a hatchet in one hand and the scalps in the other. They've since been removed, but I think that might be, you know, the statue's there with minus the scalps and the axe are gone. We don't know if it's vandalism or political correctness. No, she's just sort of standing there with her arms up in the air. What you're talking about, I guess, is partly what I would call the Howard Zinn school. As I've been profoundly influenced by Howard Zinn. So absolutely sure. This is history that also wants to focus on the obscure. And another example of that is a man who we only know by the name Madison Washington. I tell his story in this book in a chapter called Madison's Mutiny. Madison Washington was a slave. That was his slave name. He escaped from the South, got to Canada by the Underground Railroad, decided that he would go back to Virginia to rescue his wife. In the course of doing that, he was captured again, put on a slave ship, taken from Virginia down to New Orleans. In the course of that trip, he and other slaves mutinied on the ship. They sailed to Bahamas, where slavery had already been abolished. Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
These are not just the famous and the notorious, but the average person, and that's part of the hidden history that I'm talking about. Thank you for the question. Anyone else?
Can I ask, do you have any plans for the latter half of the 19th century?
The latter half of the 19th century. Well, there is a period called the Civil War in there that I actually have written. Don't know much about the Civil War, which is a standalone single volume about the Civil War. And there are indeed countless tales to tell. The truth is that I'm actually working now on a revision of Don't Know Much About History, which is sort of the 20th anniversary edition. and that will be out next year because it's been about 10 years since it was revised. And a lot of things have happened in the last 10 years that, that we have to add to the history book. So thank you all for coming, thank you for listening, and thanks for your questions. Appreciate it.